welcome to our How Can Philosophy Make Us Better Engineers talk by Dr. Fiona Truscott, lecturer in the Integrated Engineering Programme and module lead in the Engineering Challenges. Before we go to Fiona's talk, there's just a couple of housekeeping things that I'm just going to run through quickly for everyone. So this talk is part of the Spring into STEM, which is a series of talks hosted by departments within the Faculty of Engineering here at UCL. Do take a look at everything else that's on offer. There's plenty more interesting talks happening in the next few weeks. So this talk is being recorded and it will go up online at a later date. But because of this, we won't be asking participants to use their mics or videos. If you have a question, then there will be a Q&A, which will take place at the end of the talk. So for any questions that you may have, please use the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. If you have any issues, for example, you can't hear things or anything else, then please pop your message in the chat box and I'll answer it as we go along. And I think that's it for housekeeping. So I'll now pass you over to Fiona.
Cool, thank you, Emily. So I will just share my slides with you. Cool, okay, so the aim of this talk is really to kind of introduce you to the idea that in this case, philosophy and engineering are not as far apart from one another as we might have thought that they are. So let me start with the social impact of engineering. So society and engineering are intimately related to each other. They have been for thousands and thousands of years. So let me give you some examples of the relationship between society and engineering. So the classic example is around communication technology. I think we all know about the discussions around social media, around the use of mobile phones. We're now all constantly contactable. We're always online. You can always get hold of any information you want. You can order stuff from your phone, you know, and the changes in society that has made. So stuff around the blurring of the lines between work and home. We've seen this, you know, really forcefully with working from home and the difference that makes to people's lives, both positive and negative. And all of this discussion about the radical changes in society. It's a revolution. It's, you know, completely destroying things, or it's completely changing people's interactions. Interestingly, if you look at the discussion around the introduction of the printing press, it's very similar themes that come up. You know, the printing press is going to destroy society. It's going to completely change it. It's a revolution in who has access to technology and who has access to information, and, you know, the speed with which we can get information. We see revolution like newspapers suddenly becomes a thing that people can have because we can print them, you know, and it was seen as kind of blasphemous, the end of civilization, very similar. Complete revolution in society. And I don't think you would get that if that wasn't making a big impact on society. People wouldn't be writing these kinds of things if these weren't big changes to the way society worked and how we get information or how we interact with each other even. But for me, it's even more fundamental, the impact that technology can have on society. This is a pacemaker. So if in your heart, you have what are referred to as pacemaker cells. What they do is they ensure that your heartbeat is regular. So they make sure you have a regular heartbeat and, you know, you just kind of live your life. And if they get damaged, these can be now replaced with this mechanical, an electronic pacemaker. And then you can just continue. This is a really routine operation, really routine procedure. And people have it all the time, and people, you know, just have this operation and then continue for their lives as they were before. And this medical interventions like this, the use of medical technology has really changed who can actually be part of society. If we imagine, you know, the impact of injectable insulin on type 1 diabetics, you know, that's completely changed their experience of living and how they can manage their disease. A personal one for me is some of the stuff around maternal health. I have a couple of friends who've recently given birth. One of them's had an emergency cesarean section, and all of the changes and developments in technology for maternal health have meant that, you know, that's no longer a really dangerous period of someone's life, giving birth. It's now, you know, most people have almost no complications with it. It's, you know, if you need an emergency cesarean section, it's very routine, it's done all the time. And for me, that's fascinating. You know, my friend who had one, she would be dead if she had not had one, you know, 100 years ago or so. So these are really changing who is in society, our expectations of our lives, you know, and our expectations of what medical science can do and change the way we live our lives. And those two examples, we may be feeling, wow, that's very much how engineering is impacting society, but hang on a minute, you've got this double-headed arrow. How is society impacting engineering? Well, engineering is done by people for people. So we bring our kind of expectations, our norms, our cultural decisions into it. But a really clear example of how society impacts engineering is this. This is Viagra. Right? It was originally designed as a heart drug. It went into clinical trials to treat heart disease. And it was terrible at treating heart disease, really didn't make any effect at all. But several of the clinical trial participants mentioned that it had this very interesting side effect. And what Pfizer realized is actually society would really like a temporary cure to male impotence. They could sell this for a lot of money. Now, this is an issue that's not life or death. But it's something that people want solved, essentially. And it's now $1 billion market for stuff like Viagra. People are suggesting they're trying to find, you know, the female Viagra. It's now something that we all know of, and we're all aware of what the treatments are for it. And this is because society is interested. And the converse is true. There are things called orphan diseases, where there is very little research from pharmaceutical companies on treatments for them, because the people that would take the treatments have a relatively low average income, there's a relatively small number of them, and so the market to sell that drug to is tiny. It's not worth putting the research in unless you're in a university where a lot of the research on orphan diseases is happening. So again, society can decide what is important and make us kind of focus on various different areas within engineering. So, okay, I've sold you on the concept that there's a social impact of engineering, and we need to take that into account as engineers. We need to know that our work impacts society. But how are we going to make decisions around this? We're going to have to come up with some way of doing it to make important societal impacting decisions. Now, this is where the philosophy comes in, because it turns out there's a group of philosophers who have been thinking about these decisions for a very long time. Ethicists have spent over 2,000 years discussing how to make societal impacting decisions, or as their terminology is, moral decisions, ethical decisions. So how can we as engineers think about ethics, and can we use some of what they've discussed and thought about rather than coming up with our own kind of reinventing the wheel? So how can we think about ethics? Well, there's actually 3 ways as engineers we can think about ethics. We can think about professional ethics. Now, if you're involved in engineering, I'm sure you've seen something like this. This is the beginning of the Code of Professional Conduct for the Institute of Chemical Engineers. When you become a member, you have to agree that you're going to abide by the Code of Professional Conduct. And it talks about things about acting with integrity, within the public interest. You have to uphold certain standards of behavior. But what it really doesn't tell us is actually how to make those decisions, how we might go about doing them. It's really what's expected of us as engineers, as professionals. So I'm not really going to talk about professional ethics very much. But we can look at theory. As I said, people have been thinking about this for over 2,000 years. They've come up with some ideas and some frameworks about how people make ethical decisions. So they've gone, here we go. How might you make an ethical decision? How might we go about thinking that process? And so this can give us some insight into how people in general might make these decisions. But we're engineers. We're really interested in practical ethics, really. we've got a problem in front of us. We need to solve it. How are we going to discuss solving it? And that's what we're going to talk about. So we're going to talk a little bit of theory, and then we're really going to talk about how we as engineers can approach ethical problems and how we do it within the faculty. So first off, I can't talk about philosophy without mentioning Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham's considered the kind of spiritual founder of UCL, and so much so, in fact, that we have his auto icon in a box in the Student Centre. So if you've not visited UCL, if you've not been to see Jeremy Bentham, I recommend it. Not many other universities have a utilitarian philosopher in a box. It's one of our kind of unique selling points. And we're interested in, because he is considered kind of the godfather of utilitarianism. He's the first person to really set it out as a philosophical argument for how people can make decisions. And at its very simplest, very basic, utilitarianism is this: the ethical action is the one that causes the most happiness for the largest number of people. So it's really focused on community and collective impact. We're interested in kind of value for money, essentially, in our ethical decisions. We want happiness, we want it for the most number of people. And so what it means is it's very context dependent. All actions are on the table, right? It's about what is the best action in that context. It could be that that action is ethical in one context and unethical in another, okay? So that's utilitarianism. So when philosophers discuss these frameworks, what they do is, if they don't agree with them, they try and knock them down with what's referred to as counterexamples. And these are situations where the ethical framework doesn't produce what we would consider the ethical decision. And the classic one in terms of utilitarianism is around slavery. So you may have seen the big plot hole in the middle of utilitarianism, that if you cause unhappiness for a minority of people, but that produces happiness for a majority of people, that becomes the ethical decision, you see. Now, I have to say, Bentham and this is John Stuart Mill, who both wrote extensively on utilitarianism, actually have a much more nuanced view of it, and actually it's not quite as straightforward as that. But John Stuart Mill in particular realised that this was an issue within utilitarianism and added a caveat to that first sentence, which is avoids harm to individuals. So that hopefully kind of avoids the counterexample for utilitarianism. But they, as I said, they have lots of kind of nuance around what is happiness. They do this thing called hedonistic calculus, which is very different to the calculus we usually do in engineering. Very much a very different thing to help you calculate how much happiness and how many people you're going to provide for it. So that's utilitarianism, very much community-minded, context-dependent. What if you weren't interested in context, though? So this is Immanuel Kant. He is interestingly writing at roughly the same time as Bentham, but he completely disagrees with Bentham. He's like, I'm sorry, you can't use people as a means to getting better happiness for most people. Sentient beings are important and they are kind of special, which means that they should be treated as an end. They are important in and of themselves, not what they can do for us as a community. And there are certain duties and responsibilities that come from that. And so he felt that there were universal laws. In fact, he phrases it like this: act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become universal law. So if you want to say don't lie, you have to say don't lie under any circumstances. Okay, it's got to be universal. You can't just not lie in some cases, but you can lie in other places. That was his belief. These are universal laws, and that's his theory. It's sometimes referred to as the categorical imperative, because it is an imperative for you to act that way. Now, I think we can all think of counterexamples to this, places where what we would usually consider an unethical action become ethical or certainly acceptable. I mean, the obvious one in the current environment is around war. But the one I quite like, which suggests certainly the type of movies that philosophers like to watch, is one that's related to slasher movies. So the axe-wielding murderer breaks into your house and says to you, if you give me the names and locations of all your friends and family so that I can go away and murder them, I will spare your life. And obviously we would think that the ethical action there is to lie to the axe murderer, suggest that you don't know, or maybe they're all conveniently at a police station nearby. But Kant says that's lying, and you can't lie under any circumstances. You have to tell him the truth. And we would suggest that that's possibly not the ethical action there. So as you can see, there are issues with both of these, and what we tend to think about them is they are essentially two ends of the spectrum, really. They're the extreme ends, and really everyone within this spectrum is really, we're kind of making decisions somewhere along that spectrum. We're kind of thinking we want to do the most good for the most people, but also there are some red lines that we're not going to follow through on. So that gives you a framework for how people make decisions. This gives us an idea of how the people maybe that we are designing for or creating products for are making ethical decisions, but also might give us a little bit of a framework for how we might make ethical decisions. But what we haven't really addressed is practical ethical problems. And we're engineers, and if we're not anything else, we are practical. So let's talk about practical ethical problems. What we know about them is they aren't multiple choice questions. It isn't you either do this or you do that, and one of these is ethically right and one of these is ethically wrong, right? They are not that. What they are complex problems with constraints and requirements that need to be hit. We usually have incomplete information, so we're either having to make a judgment or we need to go and do some research, and there is no unique right answer. And if you're an engineer or working in engineering, you may be thinking, this sounds familiar. I feel like I've done this before. And that's because these are very similar to design problems. We talk about design problems in the same way. So this is something that engineers are really familiar with. This is what we solve on a day-to-day basis. You know, I'm going to design a new car seat for babies. That's a design problem, and you will have criteria for it. So for those of you who are not solving design problems on a day-to-day basis, let me talk you through how we as engineers approach them. Every design problem has a set of criteria and requirements. So for example, with the baby seat design problem, you may need it to be particularly protective. You may need to for it to weigh a certain amount so it's liftable. I have friends who swear by the seats that rotate so you can get the baby out more easily. You may wish to have that. There's lots of things that we can think about that they need to be able to do. They need to be in lots of different cars, for example. We will then, as engineers, either in a team or by ourselves, usually in a team, brainstorm a whole load of ideas. It's kind of, you know, that classic moment where there's post-it notes all over the shop and someone's drawing something on a whiteboard and then someone else is scribbling it out. That's us brainstorming a ton of ideas. Some of them will fit the criteria and the requirements, and some of them don't. And we remove the ones that don't hit the criteria, and then we will select one of these, what we refer to as successful ideas, so the ones that hit the criteria. So they're all successful ideas. Any one of them will be a good solution to the design problem, but we will select them based on our personal preferences. So it will be things about, for example, we prioritize certain different things, safety or weight. And so we'll have, each one will select is different. And the key point is if you give this problem to a group of people or a group of teams, each person will choose a slightly different successful solution depending on their own preferences, their own experience, their own priorities. And that's how you end up with this range of car seats that you can buy from different companies. Each company's design group will have prioritized different things. And it may be something as simple as color or weight, or it may be safety requirements or the ability to fit different cars. And so that's how we end up, but these are all successful solutions. So we can use exactly the same process for solving ethical problems. But I guess the big question is hang on a minute, what are the criteria and requirements for ethical problems? Because they're not going to be, it needs to weigh under 100 grams or it needs to cost less than $100 or something. That's not really considered ethical issues. So what do our criteria look like? And then we can just go through the same process. So this is where Bentham and Kant come back in again, because we can consider what Bentham and Kant would think as requirements for an ethical problem or criteria. So Bentham would be really interested in harms. This is what he wants to avoid. He wants to produce happiness and avoid harm. And when we talk about harms, we're looking at a really wide lens for this, okay? So we're thinking direct harms, so that's where maybe someone gets injured in a construction accident, or indirect harms, that would be where, you know, you increase the traffic in an area, you increase the air pollution, you maybe increase the carbon dioxide emissions, that increases the effects of climate change, and then you cause flooding somewhere else in the world. So that's an indirect harm. And these can be, you know, we tend to think of physical when we talk about harms, but these can be economic, environmental, psychological, reputational. As I said, we're looking at the broadest possible lens of harms that we want to try and avoid when we're tackling an ethical problem. So that's Bentham. Where would Kant be coming at from this? So Kant would be coming at, he'd be looking for the red lines, he'd be looking for the universal laws. And we can think of this as values or beliefs or principles. So you want to make it as accessible as possible, or you want to ensure community involvement, what we sometimes refer to as user voice in design. And a key one maybe that we can really kind of get our heads around is around research areas. I used to work in biotechnology, and you can think of all of the controversy around various bits of biotechnology, all of the big ethical questions around what you can use biotechnology tools for. And a lot of my colleagues have red lines of, you know, I'm not going to touch that piece of research or that area of research because I don't want to work on that. You know, that's not something I'm interested in, or I don't want to be involved in making that ethical decision, or that's my personal decision about what I'm going to work on. And so that is really around red lines, and that's where Kant would come in. So we've got our criteria and our requirements, and so we can now go through the same process that we would for a design problem. And so that gives us a practical way of approaching design problems as engineers. So the final thing I want to talk about, to bring up, is this, social justice. It's kind of, so what I've really discussed is kind of accepted engineering and ethics interaction. It's, you know, you can read books about how these things work, and you'll be able to kind of have a look in the library for those kind of things. But this is the new area of ethics in engineering, and possibly the slightly controversial area of ethics in engineering around social justice. So I'm not going to go into definitions of social justice or any kind of lots of detail of it, because that is a whole talk just in itself. But one way of defining it is how we distribute benefits and risks to make the world a better place. And one of the reasons we need to think about this as engineers is we tend to be creating those benefits and risks. You know, think of all the kinds of technology we produce. You know, we tend to be responsible for, in part, producing these. So the way to think about this is, you've got a chemical plant, it's producing the latest cancer drug, let's say, but it does produce also chemical waste. Where are you going to put that new plant? Are you going to put it in Chelsea or Kensington? Or are you going to put it in Stevenage, where there are already industrial plants around, or Harlow, which is the same in London? So are you going to put it in the place where the rich people are, who you might think have the money to kind of, you know, mitigate the effects of it? You know, they might be able to also buy the product if it's really expensive. Or are you going to put it where there's already industrial work going on, land prices are much cheaper, there's already existing infrastructure, you know, and people might need jobs, for example, in that area? It's a really complicated problem. We tend to cluster our industrial areas, but that just means we are putting all the risks in one place. But we might also be putting all the benefits. It's a very complicated issue about how you spread those things out. And what it also is not something that's just decided by one engineer. These things are decided by politicians, by planners, by management of companies, by architects, by you know, loads of different groups of engineers, chemical engineers, structural engineers. So one engineer in one company can't necessarily really affect that much, okay? So it's really tricky to know precisely how much you need to do. You can ensure that you're including as many diverse voices as you can, but you're not the only person making that decision. But there is one area where engineers have the loudest voice in the room, okay? And they can make a really big impact. And that is we come back to design, okay? Because engineers tend to be the major force in design. And the two big questions that we really need to think about are, who are we designing for and how will they use it? And who are you maybe not designing for? Who are you making assumptions about how they're going to use it? There's lots and lots of examples I can give you where designers have kind of assumed something about their users that isn't true. There are a lot of Glaswegians who were originally very annoyed with Siri because it couldn't understand their accent when it first came out, for I think really obvious reasons about why Apple might have neglected to include a Glaswegian accent when they were training Siri, possibly for the very relatively small population of people that affects. But one that I think really encapsulates how much impact these design decisions and these sometimes regulatory decisions can have is around crash test dummies. So crash test dummies, up until relatively recently, regulations for the safety tests that you needed to pass to ensure that your car was safe to go on the road involved the use of a 50 percentile male dummy. So this is a dummy based on male anatomy, and it weighs 50% of men weigh more than this and are taller than this. 50% of men weigh less and are shorter than this dummy. So this dummy is 1.77 meters tall and 76 kilograms heavy. And it should be noted that this is taller and heavier than the average female. It also has very different anatomy. Women, for example, have less muscle mass in their necks. And I think you can think of various other bits of women's anatomy that are very different to men in there. And what does this mean? You might be like, well, okay, yeah, it's just a crash test dummy. It doesn't, what it means is the cars are designed with this dummy to pass the safety crash test. So this is the kind of person that the car is assuming it needs to protect from a crash. And this means that, women tend to not be in the right position. This is because they tend to sit further forward, because they're shorter. They also tend to sit higher up so they can see over the dashboard because they're shorter. So this means they tend to be what's referred to as out of position drivers. So they're not where the car expects them to be in a crash, or where the safety systems have been designed for them to be in the event of a crash. What it also means is that modern seats are too firm for female drivers, so they throw them forward faster because acceleration is force and mass, and if you decrease the mass, keep the force the same, you're increasing acceleration. But they also don't deform as much on impact. So that's how we dissipate energy in the course of a crash. That's why you've got all these crumple zones on the cars. You're deforming it rather than transferring it to the people within. You might be like, okay, still I don't really get what the impact of this is. This is the impact. Women are 17% more likely to die in the event of a car crash because the car is not designed to protect someone built like them. They are 47% more likely to be seriously injured, and they are 72% more likely to have minor injuries. And it is even worse if you are a pregnant woman. 62% of pregnant women in their third trimester cannot do up their seatbelt. And you can think of a really obvious reason why women need to be in a car at the end of the third trimester. Right? And what that also means is that maternal trauma due to car crashes is one of the leading causes of fetal death. Okay, so this can have a really big impact because the car is simply not designed with these people in mind, because this is not the dummy that needs to pass the regulatory test. And this is maybe one of the more extreme impacts, but it really gives you an insight into how design decisions can really impact specific groups of society. So, better engineering. How do we get better engineering? Hopefully what I've been able to kind of persuade you of and give you an introduction to is the fact that ethics is not a completely separate topic that we can just hive off to some philosophers in a corner, but that actually we already have the tools to think about ethical problems. We are already discussing ethics. We just don't know it. And we can do ethics as engineers really, really easily. And the ethics will help us better understand and choose our impact as engineers, rather than just hoping that people use it well and that we've done the best we can. And it can give us insight into the people we're designing for, so that we can design better, more useful pieces of kit or processes or apps or whatever that actually do what the people that use them want them to do, and well. So hopefully that's given you an insight into this. If you've got any questions, please pop them in the Q&A and I would be happy to answer any of them for you. So let's see. Let me see if we've got any questions. No questions yet. Feel free to, I should probably point out that I'm not a philosopher. So if you have any deep philosophical questions, maybe don't ask me those. But yeah, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have about engineering and ethics. Cool. So we have, I'd like to know about how the consideration of ethics is integrated into postgrad engineering courses in UCL. So I will give you a brief introduction to how we do it in general. I mainly teach on undergraduate courses, but the philosophy of teaching ethics is really the same across the entire faculty. So we really focus on embedding it within engineering practice. So we do a lot of project work within the faculty. And so what we do is we usually have projects which have a setting. So we ask students, you know, not only here is a technical issue that we would like you to solve, but we also want you to think about the users, about their values, about what they might want, how they might interact with it. We sometimes do it explicitly. We sometimes talk about it in relation to design, you know, how that works. And so we're asking, we're really doing it via kind of case studies and in the course of your engineering practice whilst you learn at UCL, because what we don't think of it, as I said, is a separate topic. You know, it's not a module that you need to take and then, you know, we never come back to it. It's really how you deal with it in the real. So that's really how we teach engineering and ethics within engineering within UCL. So yeah, I can give you a few examples if you want more details, but it's embedded in the whole process rather than being taught separately. Oh, okay, good question. At one point, can someone disregard ethics as regards privacy when it comes to the general good of humanity? That's a really good, difficult question to answer. One of the things around ethics is that it's very grey, which is very different to the way that maybe engineers like answers to be and discussions and questions to be, to have a bit of a black and white. We're probably more used to a black and white yes or no answer. This is a really difficult question around privacy. We've seen it be really key issues around how privacy and what kind of rights we have to privacy and how we should behave with that, and when you can disregard someone's right to privacy. And I think that is a really complex question. I think we could, you know, go through all the arguments for and against it, but I think you'd have to get an actual ethicist, and possibly, because it's really related a lot to big data. So within UCL, we've got the Alan Turing Institute, and they do a lot around data ethics. And so they have thought deeply about how you retain people's privacy, but also use big data and large sets of data in really interesting and creative ways that produce really interesting outputs. I have a friend who has worked on a system around identifying children who may be at risk of child abuse. So this is a really laudable reason to get big groups of data. But then you have the question of how do you maybe ensure people's privacy, ensure the security of that data. You know, is it a good thing that you can now look into maybe people's behavioral patterns around that, even if you're doing it for really good intentions, what are you going to pick up along the way, essentially? And he had to really think through the ethics and how they used the system when they were producing that kind of system and using data in that way. So I think it's very much, we might be going down the Bentham, you know, it's a little bit Bentham because it's very context dependent, but I think there's a lot of, you have to have very strict regulation around how you use and when you remove someone's privacy. And it's very strict, and we're almost a little bit camped there with maybe we err on the side of not removing it. It's very context dependent, I'm afraid, that one. How can we train or improve ethical attitudes as engineers? Well, I think really bringing it into the everyday language. So actually stuff like this where we go, you know, it's not completely different. It's something, it's a key skill that you need as an engineer. And I think really bringing it into the realm of what engineers are familiar with. I think we sometimes teach ethics, you know, in general within engineering, as here are some really important philosophers that you need to know. Now go and do some ethics. And I think what we need to understand is philosophers kind of write and talk in a very specific way. They can be quite jargony in the way that, you know, we can be quite jargony in engineering, and, you know, kind of just produce our own ideas and that kind of thing. And so what we really need is someone as an intermediary to try to bring it into the engineering space, make it make sense within engineering, so that we can see that it is this key skill to being engineers. I mean, ethics is really embedded in a lot of what we do. Within UCL, we teach human-centered design, which really puts the users and the stakeholders of a design problem central, and we really want to think about them. That's really what we're thinking when I talked about social justice. So we're almost already doing it as engineers. We just need to be really aware of what we're doing and how we're doing it. So I think bringing it into the engineering space, making it make sense, and then case studies and showing people how, you know, how this impacts, where this impacts come from. I really recommend Invisible Women as a book by Caroline Credo-Perez, because it's all about the data gap around different genders and how much information, how we assume, you know, data from one data set must be relevant to another group of people when it really isn't. And I really recommend it because it just gives you all these design examples of where it's sort of fallen down, that assumption. So yeah, so that's how we can train engineers in it. I think discussing it, making it a really common part of engineering, that it's not a nice add-on, it's a key skill, but also recognizing that we need to bring kind of ethical theories into engineering space almost to make it feel like it's not a completely different odd thing that someone else does. Any other questions? I think we've answered all of those. So yeah, if you've got any other questions, feel free to answer them, or ask them even, and I'll try and answer them. As I said, there may be some where we have to refer to some specialists who have thought deeply about some of these complex problems in the future. Oh, could I please repeat the book recommendation? Yeah, sure. So it's the one I referenced on the final slide about the crash test dummies. It's called Invisible Women. It's by Caroline Credo-Perez. And as I said, it's all about the data gap between genders and what information we have about how, for example, men use transport systems in general versus how women generally use transport systems, and how that's affected design decisions, and the assumption that maybe what we know about men covers all people. Could I please share some books on engineering ethics? So I can, yeah, there's a few. So I really recommend, not just on, this one's just ethics in general. So the Oxford Very Short Introduction to Ethics is a really good way of getting an overview of the ethics and the kind of field itself. There's also one called Engineering Ethics by Deborah, I can't remember, it's on my desk. I might have to kind of add these at the end, but it's just called Engineering Ethics, and that one's a fantastic introduction to ethical questions within engineering. It was published in the past couple of years, that one. And those are the ones I'd really recommend. There's lots of them. You can find various different books. I'd also recommend Inferior and Superior by Angelina Zanini. They're wider about the impact of science in terms of women, and of course in race and ethnic minorities. And those are both really interesting books as well around, they're a bit wider lens, but the kind of how science has been used to maybe kind of perpetuate various different myths around those ones. So I'd really recommend those books around engineering ethics. And then, you know, you can kind of go off in any direction you like. What I probably wouldn't recommend is directly reading Philosophers. As I said, they tend to be a bit jargony. Bentham is quite good. John Stuart Mill is a bit wordy. Kant is really difficult to read. But yeah, finding summaries of stuff is the best way, and those are probably the best books that I can recommend at the moment for engineering ethics itself. Yep, cool. Any other questions? Pop them in the Q&A, and we'll give a good go at answering them. Who wrote the Inferior? So Inferior and Superior are two separate books. They're by Angela Zanini, S-A-N-I-N-I. And they're both fantastic books, just on science and social justice in general. So I completely recommend both of those. Yep. Is there at least a public engineering figure who is monumental in terms of considering ethics in his field? That's a really interesting question. In terms of the kind of obvious non-examples of this, or maybe some of the kind of big tech giants where we've got, you know, you've seen issues around Facebook and how Facebook is used, same with Twitter, around these ethical issues around who should be allowed on the platform, what speech should be allowed on the platform. So probably those are probably people, really good case examples of where people have assumed that if I wouldn't put this up, therefore no one will put this up. I think in terms of ethics, yeah, I think I'm trying to think of someone in specific. There's some really interesting startups around where they've decided, how they've decided to look at their company formats, for example, or how they've decided to approach, for example, reinvestment, or how they've looked after their employees, or where they're going to source their resources from. I don't think anyone in particular is kind of popping into mind as specifically ethics. I think it really, what it does in part show you is how key to engineering it is, that it is a really key part of engineering, that it's really obvious when it's not there, but when it is there, we sort of just see it as the kind of just good engineering, really, rather than necessarily good, you know, specifically good at ethics. Yeah, so that it's almost, it's one of those things like, I guess, good sound design on a film, where if you don't notice it, it's good, but you really notice it when it's not there. I think is one of the things with ethics, is we just think of it as good design or good engineering. So yeah. I'd like to know if there's any systematic theory concerning the ethics of engineering tech, or is it possible to form a systematic theory on this area? So I think one of the things you need to remember, one of the issues with ethics is it involves people, and people are complex. So it's really difficult to have the way to solve an ethical problem. Like, I can't give you a framework that will work every single time. I think what you can see from, Kant and Bentham is that people have been thinking about this for thousands of years. If someone had come up with the ethical framework, we would know about it by now. It's really not possible to come up with just a systematic way. The closest we can get is how we approach those ethical problems as design problems, and actually thinking through this. And that's because, unfortunately, society, people, context is really complicated, and it's very difficult to kind of encapsulate that all in one theory or way forward for doing it. So yeah, unfortunately, I think I'm not going to be able to tell you this is, you produce an algorithm and you feed in your ethical issue and it will tell you what the right way forward is. That is certainly not in the near future, and I think is a really difficult conceptual problem that we're not going to be able to solve really very easily at all. So yeah, I think it's really about providing engineers with the skill sets to analyze an ethical problem, to really think through the ethics of what they're working on and help them find ways to make decisions. And those things are always going to be personal. What I think is ethical may be not quite what various other people think is ethical, or may not be the decision that they would make under the same circumstances, because they have different personal red lines, for example. So yeah, I think really, I'm not sure it's really possible. I mean, many things are possible with the way kind of machine learning and AI is going, but I think this might be one of the things where, we really just have to give people the skills to make the decision, and then, kind of you go off and do it, unfortunately. What is your approach to social justice in engineering design? Providing engineers with a broad range of skills or encouraging them to work with other people with different types of expertise? Both really, both. I think we're only just starting to consider as a social justice in engineering as engineering as a community is only just starting to engage with it. So I think the answer is both. I think one of the things we see within various bits of research around diverse teams is that they tend to be more culturally, tend to be more aware of cultural context. They tend to bring in a lot of different viewpoints. So you tend to get something that fits much better for potential users, certainly for a wide range of potential users. So having that diverse group of people, either within engineering or bringing people from outside of engineering. And what we really do focus on when we teach is giving students the skills to be able to work in teams, to be able to work with lots of different groups of people. How do you communicate with, non-specialists in your area, that kind of thing. So we really give the students those skills so they can work in these diverse teams. But I think it is also a matter of giving them a broad range of skills and introducing them to these concepts, giving them skill sets to engage with this as well. How might we think about ethics? How might we kind of start considering the ethical or even sustainability that's kind of related to social justice as well, or cultural context, which is a little bit related to sustainability. So really it's both. It's giving people the ability to do both of these things, that they have the skills to bring in expertise, but also they're aware that these things are needed, that there is a social justice issue or around design, that they do need to consider this. And that those kind of work hand in hand, because once you realize it's an issue, you're like, hang on a minute, I'm going to need to get someone else involved. Like, I'm not going to know all the answers to this. I need to bring other people in. So it's really kind of hand in hand is both of those processes, really. Cool. Let's see, do we have any others? Any other questions? Oh, right, yeah. Oh yeah, we do have a responsible innovation course within UCL that is open to external people. not just kind of open to anyone. And you can kind of look at the response. It's a joint course between engineering and science and technology studies, and talks about how to think about kind of, I guess, ethics within an innovation, but it's how to ensure that you're not kind of you're doing positive impact when you're innovating. I've taken it, it's very good. Stephen, who runs it, is very nice. He's very good at explaining these things. How is my view towards the metaverse? Oh, that is a complex question to ask with 7 minutes to go. It's really tricky. The internet in general is a massive ethical question, I think. You know, these things, it's been a fantastic tool for connection. You know, I found some really interesting podcasts and interesting, you know, writers that I would just never have found had they not been linked by friends, or had I not found them through kind of chains of interest. You know, I can look up, you know, any bit of information I want, and I can find out everything I'm interested in. You know, I can go down a rabbit hole and I can find this stuff out. But it does kind of open itself, because it's so open, we can think of all the ways that it can be misused as well. And as a kind of woman on the internet, I've been lucky so far, but I'm very aware of, you know, what has happened to maybe, you know, outspoken women or women who've expressed particular opinions on the internet, and the same for people from other underrepresented groups. And it's really tricky, you know, is it good? I mean, I'm also a big fan of science fiction novels, and some of them where you kind of, you know, The Matrix, where you get lost in the, you know, in the virtual reality space and you never come back out again. And this kind of thing is, you know, maybe not the best way forward, who knows? So I think these things are really complicated, and that they have positives and negatives. And one of the things I like about ethics, and one of the reasons I teach it, is because they are these kind of judgment calls. They are these grey areas, which make it really tricky. You know, again, it's really difficult. It is around discussing the positives and negatives and trying to make those judgment calls, those weigh up about whether it's useful or not, or what limits you put on tools, for example, what you can't use it for, you ensure that it's not usable for. So yeah, the metaverse is a really interesting question. I think I also need to see more of it. I want to kind of try it out. I'm interested in how it works, I guess. It's kind of, I don't know, I've done some virtual reality stuff, and it's very strange. It's very odd kind of experience to be in a virtual reality space. So it is an interesting tool. I think it's going to have positives and negatives. There's going to be some really fun stuff that works on it. There's going to be some really terrible things that happen, and we'll kind of have to see how it works. And maybe we should be having a discussion about the limits that we put on technology that we produce, or walking into this really wide-eyed about how it could be used, and how we might prevent some of the abuse of it. How do you integrate the aspects of EDI and engineering ethics? That's a really interesting question. The way we tend to approach EDI is very similar to the way we approach ethics. We embed it, and we're certainly trying to embed it across our teaching. And what we do want people to think about is, I think it's really key to that question around social justice and design. Who are you designing for? So EDI is equality, diversity, and inclusion. And what it does is the question of how do you ensure, you know, diverse voices within engineering? How do you ensure you're covering you're making something that works for as many people as possible? So I think it's around bringing those kind of concepts into your ethical thinking and into your design right from the beginning. So really understanding who your users are, what they need, how they work. That's one of the reasons we teach it within design right from the beginning, because it's fundamental to the design. And this is ethics. This is part of how we embed ethics in engineering. I mean, we tend to talk about it from a design point of view, but it is really also an ethical question. How are you ensuring that people can access, can use your kit? And also one of the things one of the easiest ways, I guess, that sounds like it's not possibly quite the right word, is to ensure that you have a diverse engineering community so that you're always bringing these viewpoints in. And that's something that is also really key and is a little bit of an ethical social justice question of how you ensure that it's open to a wide, diverse range of people as a discipline. And that's something that we do work on within the faculty, of how we get more, diverse people within our faculty, both students and staff. So it's complicated, but you kind of just bring it in all the time. We kind of all the time kind of bring it in and consider it as an aspect. Ooh. Any other questions? So yeah, I don't think we've got any other questions.
Great. I think I think we've exhausted all the questions. Yeah, amazing. Yeah, thank you so much, Fiona, for your talk. That was really interesting, and yeah, great to hear from you. And thank you to all the participants for asking their questions as well. In the chat box, I've put the links to the rest of the Spring into STEM talk, so please check those out. And also I've put the feedback form in there, so I would really appreciate if you don't mind taking a couple of minutes just to complete that for us. I think that's everything. Yeah, thank you again.